Nolan Graves had asked for someone steady. What he got was Audra Crane, 26 years old, traveling alone, with a bruise fading yellow at her jaw and eyes that catalogued every exit before she'd even set down her bag. The stage into Delwood, Texas arrived 40 minutes late on a Thursday in October. Nolan was waiting outside the land office where he'd arranged to meet her, hat in his hands, boots already dusty from the ride in. He'd placed the advertisement 6 weeks prior. Single words, nothing decorative. Widowed rancher, 31, seeks capable wife. Work is hard and the land is harder. No sentiment required. He'd received 2 responses. One was a school teacher from Ohio who wrote about sunsets in God's country and had clearly never touched a fence post in her life. The other came without a surname at first, just initials, AC, and a letter so plainly written it could have been a land survey. I can cook, manage a household, keep books, and work beside a man without needing to be thanked for it. I need to be somewhere my brother cannot find me. If that is agreeable, I am available to travel by the end of the month. He'd written back with the date and the town. She'd confirmed. That was the extent of their courtship. When the stage door opened, Nolan watched a man in a traveling coat climb out first, then a woman with a carpet bag and a pinched expression who was clearly somebody's wife already. Then Audra stepped down, and he knew before she even scanned the street that she was his. Not in the way men sometimes said that about women, like ownership, but in the way you recognize a person who is carrying something heavy and has learned to carry it quietly. She was dark-haired, dressed in a gray wool coat that had seen better years, with a canvas satchel worn over one shoulder and a small trunk she'd already gripped before the driver could reach it. She looked at Nolan the way a person looks at a bridge they're not sure will hold. Nolan Graves? She said it without a question mark. That's me. She crossed the distance between them with measured steps. Audra Crane. She did not offer her hand. The ranch. How far? About an hour's ride west. Good. She turned toward his wagon. Let's go before dark. She settled herself on the bench before he could help with the trunk. He loaded it himself and climbed up beside her. They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. Nolan had never been a man who filled silence with noise, but this was a different kind of quiet, the kind that had something pressed down underneath it. You came from San Antonio? He asked eventually. A pause. Before that, Kansas City. Before that, I'd rather not say. He didn't push. The ranch came into view as the light turned amber. 200 acres on the western edge of Harker County, a house his grandfather had built from local limestone, solid if not pretty, a barn that needed one corner repaired, a small bunkhouse nobody had used in 2 years. Nolan ran it alone now. He'd been running it alone for 3 years. Audra looked at it the way people look at things they are deciding whether to trust. How many head, she asked. 80 cattle, 14 horses, some chickens. She nodded. Any workers? Just me. Her jaw shifted slightly. We'll see about that. Inside, the house was clean. He'd made sure of it, swept the floor, opened the windows, replaced the straw in the guest mattress. It still smelled like a man's house, a little like coffee and a little like saddle leather, but she didn't comment on it. I'll take the room at the back, she said, already moving toward it. That room's not been used in a while, Nolan said. Might need airing. I'll manage. She set the canvas satchel down carefully when she reached the doorway, fingers keeping hold of the strap a moment longer than necessary. Then she went in. He heard her open the window, heard her moving things around. When she came back out, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. I'll start supper, she said, and tomorrow I want to see your account ledger. He almost smiled. All right. Dinner was beans and salt pork, which was what he had. She made it better than he did. Added something from a small tin she'd kept in her satchel, some dried herb he didn't recognize. They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the silence less tense now than it had been in the wagon. I should tell you something, she said when the plates were nearly empty. All right. She set down her fork and looked at him straight on. I have a brother. His name is Clifton Crane. He controls a lot of money. Our father's estate, which should have been split between us, but wasn't, because our father wrote a will that gave Clifton authority over my portion until I married with his approval. Audra's voice was level, almost administrative. Clifton does not approve of much. He selected a husband for me. I refused. He selected another. I refused again. When he told me the third man's name, I left the next morning. Nolan looked at her. How long ago was that? 4 months, and he's been looking for you since. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Yes, he has a man named Pruitt who finds people. She touched her jaw, not quite reaching the faded bruise. Pruitt found me in Kansas City. That's why I left. Nolan set his coffee cup down. You're telling me this now. I thought you should know before tomorrow. In case someone comes asking. Nobody's coming to my land asking for anything, he said quietly. She don't know Clifton. I know enough. He looked at her steady. You're here. That's what matters. She searched his face for something. Doubt, maybe, or calculation. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. She picked up her fork again.
We'll see if you still say that when he gets here.
The next morning, Audra was in the kitchen before Nolan woke. Coffee already made, the ledger from his desk open on the table beside her plate. He stopped in the doorway.
You went through my books.
You left them on the desk.
She didn't look up.
Your feed costs are wrong. You're paying 20% more per hundredweight than you should be. Either the man you're buying from is cheating you or someone is skimming. Nolan came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down. That's from Teller's Supply in town. I've been using them for 5 years. 5 years is a long time to be robbed slowly. Audra pushed the ledger toward him and pointed to a column of figures. 3 months ago you paid $4 per hundredweight on barley. 2 months ago, $4.20. Last month, $4.40.
She tapped the page.
But the delivery weights on your receipts don't match the charges. Someone is billing you for weight you didn't receive.
How much? She turned the page. Over 18 months, she said, about $260. Nolan stared at the numbers. That's not nothing. No. She retrieved the ledger and closed it.
I want to go into town this afternoon. Talk to whoever handles the billing. He drove her in after the noon chores. Teller's Supply sat near the end of the main street, a long, low building that smelled like grain and dust. The man behind the counter was young, maybe 25, with the easy confidence of someone who hadn't been caught doing anything yet. His name was Boyd Teller, the owner's nephew, as it happened, left in charge while the older man recovered from a broken leg.
He smiled at Nolan the way people smile at customers they've learned to underestimate. Nolan, he said, didn't know you were coming in. Stop by to go over some invoices, Nolan said.
This is my wife, Audra. Boyd looked at her with the kind of interest that registered her as an interruption.
Ma'am?
Audra set the ledger on the counter and opened it without preamble.
We'd like to look at your billing records for the past 18 months, she said. Specifically your delivery records against what you've invoiced.
Boyd's easy expression flickered. We keep those in the back, ma'am, and Mr.
Teller usually handles. Mr. Teller isn't here, Audra said pleasantly, so you'll handle it. She turned the ledger so the figures faced him. Let's start with March. You charge $4.20 per hundredweight on a barley delivery. Your own delivery receipt, which Mr. Graves kept, shows 68 weights delivered, but you invoiced for 75. That's 700 weights he paid for that he didn't receive.
She paused.
That happens to be illegal. Boyd's face had gone the color of old flour. That could be a clerical error. Could be. She smiled. We have 17 of them.
The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Nolan stood beside her with his arms crossed and said nothing. He didn't need to. Boyd went to the back. He was gone long enough that Nolan glanced at Audra, who gave a small shrug and waited. When Boyd returned, he had a tin cash box and the expression of someone who has just decided that certain battles aren't worth fighting. 260, Audra said. Even. Boyd counted it out on the counter with hands that weren't entirely steady. Audra took the bills, folded them once, and tucked them into her coat pocket.
We'll be using a different supplier, she said. I'd suggest you be more careful with whoever replaces us. She closed the ledger. Court is less forgiving than I am. They walked out into the thin autumn sun.
Nolan waited until they'd reached the wagon before he said anything.
You do that a lot? When it's necessary.
Audra climbed up without waiting for help. My father taught me to read ledgers before he taught me anything else. Said it was the only language that didn't lie. He thought about that as he took the reins.
What happened to him? He died 2 years ago.
Left everything in Clifton's hands and mine, technically. She looked out at the street, at nothing in particular. Clifton has a way of making technically not mean much. They were halfway home when Nolan noticed the rider.
He was sitting outside the Harker County Hotel on a bay horse, not doing anything
except watching the street with the stillness of someone being paid to notice things. He looked at Nolan's wagon and kept looking a moment too long. Nolan said nothing.
Audra had seen him too. He knew it from the way her shoulders went very slightly rigid. Is that Pruitt? He asked quietly.
No, she kept her eyes forward. But he's Clifton's. I can tell by the hat. Nolan looked at the man once more, then put his eyes back on the road. How many does he usually send?
Depends on how angry he is.
She paused. 2 more. That evening, Nolan checked the rifle above the door and the pistol in the desk drawer. Audra watched him from the kitchen table without comment. Then she reached into the canvas satchel she'd kept at her side since she arrived and withdrew a small revolver, well-maintained, and set it beside the lamp where she was working on the household accounts. He looked at the gun, then at her.
My mother's, she said. She kept it for the same reason I do.
Neither of them slept well, but the night passed quiet. What followed was 2 weeks of ordinary work. Audra woke before Nolan every morning, made coffee, and was usually already into whatever task she'd decided was most urgent by the time he came in. She reorganized the pantry, negotiated a new feed arrangement with a supplier in the next county, and rewrote the household accounts in a hand so neat and precise it looked like print. She was matter-of-fact about all of it, Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Just practical in a way that left room for other things. Nolan watched her sometimes without meaning to. The way she'd pause in the middle of something and look toward the road. The way she checked the window latch twice before bed. Fear, he recognized it because he knew what it looked like in a person who refused to let it run them. On a Tuesday in the third week, Clifton Crane arrived. Nolan was in the barn when Audra called his name. Not scared. Urgent, in the particular way that meant something specific. He came outside to find her standing in the yard watching the gate, where a man on a gray horse was dismounting with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants to make an entrance. Clifton Crane was 34, broad-shouldered, dressed for a city in a way that didn't quite work on horseback.
He looked like their father,
Audra had said once, in one of the few things she'd volunteered about her life before. He had money in his face, the particular kind of confidence that came from having never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. He smiled at Audra like he was doing her a favor by coming. "Audra," he said.
"You look thin."
She said nothing. His eyes moved to Nolan.
"You must be Graves." He said it like reading a name off a list he wasn't impressed by.
"I appreciate you taking her in, but this has gone on long enough. Audra has obligations she left behind, and it's past time she honored them." Nolan came to stand beside Audra, not in front of her, beside her. "She's my wife," Nolan said.
"Her obligations are here." Clifton's smile stayed in place. "A legal ceremony in some county clerk's office doesn't change the terms of our father's will."
Audra's inheritance, her future, is tied to decisions made by people who understood her situation better than a rancher she met 6 weeks ago.
"She's a grown woman," Nolan said.
"She makes her own decisions."
"She made a decision to steal her passage money," Clifton said smoothly, "and to breach a contract with a man whose family has significant standing in this territory." He looked at Audra. "Harlan Yost is not someone you walk away from without consequences."
"And those consequences are currently pointed in this direction."
Audra's hands were still at her sides. "Tell Harlan Yost I am married. Tell him the money was mine by right. Tell him whatever you want. I am not coming back."
Clifton looked at her the way people look at something they intend to pick up and carry whether it wants to be carried or not.
"We'll discuss this more reasonably when you've had time to." "We won't discuss it at all," Nolan said. "You've said what you came to say. Now you can go."
A pause. Clifton's smile adjusted into something cooler.
"I'll be in town a few days," he said finally, "in case you change your mind." He looked at Nolan. "And in case you reconsider the position you've put yourself in. Harlan Yost has lawyers, Mr. Graves. Good ones." He rode out slowly, back straight, like a man leaving on his own schedule. Audra waited until the sound of hooves faded before she exhaled. "He won't stop," she said. "He'll find a way. Then we'll deal with it when he does."
She turned to look at him. "Why?" She said it genuinely, the way a person asks something they've been holding back. "You could have let him take me. You would have been clear of all of it."
Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Because you're here," he said. "On my land, under my roof."
"That means something." She looked at him a long time. Then she went inside to start supper, and he stood in the yard until the light changed, thinking about what he'd just agreed to. That night, Audra told him everything. Her father, James Crane, had been a livestock broker with a reputation for fairness and a talent for making money.
When he died, he left 2 children.
Clifton, who had spent a decade cultivating the right relationships, and Audra, who had spent a decade learning everything her father knew about numbers and supply chains, and the way money actually moved. The will split the estate nominally in half, but left Clifton as executor with authority over Audra's portion, until she made a marriage he approved. The first man he chose was 53. The second was a widower with a drinking problem, and a business that needed cash more than it needed a wife. The third was Harlan Yost. "I knew about Yost," she said, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Everyone in the territory knows about Yost. He's built half his operation on other people's misfortune." She looked at the lamp flame. "He came to dinner once. He talked about my father's accounts the whole evening.
Never asked me a single question."
She paused. "The next morning I told Clifton no. He told me I didn't have that option." "What happened then?"
"He locked the gate,
"Told the housekeeper not to let me leave without an escort."
said I'd come around." "How long?" 11 days. She said it flatly, like a number in a ledger. "I got out because our housekeeper, Mrs. Aldina, was loyal to my mother before she was loyal to Clifton. She helped me get to the back road, and Pruitt found you in Kansas City. Found me and delivered a message from Clifton."
She touched her jaw again.
That same involuntary gesture. "Pruitt is not gentle with messages."
Nolan looked at his hands. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly."
"All right. Do you want to stay?" "Not because of Clifton, not because of Yost, not because you don't have somewhere else to go." "Do you want to be here?"
She was quiet for long enough that he began to regret asking.
Then she said, "I don't know how to answer that. I've spent so long making decisions based on what was safe that I've forgotten what I actually want. Then we have time to figure it out." He met her eyes. "But you should know, I meant what I said to Clifton. You're here. That counts for something with me. She nodded.
It was a small thing, but it was real. The lawyer arrived 8 days later. His name was Dryden Marsh, not from Harker County, but from Abilene, which meant Clifton had brought him in specifically, which meant Clifton was spending money, which meant Clifton was serious. He drove out to the ranch in a hired buggy and waited in the yard with his hat in his hands, and an expression of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had papers. Clifton had filed a petition claiming that Audra was acting under emotional distress and therefore not competent to have entered into a legal marriage. He had also filed a separate suit arguing that the marriage was invalid because Audra had not obtained her guardian's consent, which the will technically required until certain conditions were met. He also had an envelope,
$300, Marsh said, for your cooperation in signing the annulment.
And a statement from you that Miss Crane seemed distressed when you agreed to marry her, that she may not have been thinking clearly. Nolan looked at the envelope without touching it. That's a significant sum, Marsh offered.
It is.
And the legal costs you'll incur defending this marriage in court would likely exceed it several times over. Mr. Crane's team has considerable experience with it. No. Marsh blinked.
I beg your pardon? I said no. Nolan handed the envelope back. Tell Crane she's my wife. She stays.
Marsh looked at him the way lawyers look at people they think are making expensive mistakes. You'll receive a summons within the week. I'd recommend retaining counsel, though for what it's worth, the timeline for these proceedings will be—
You can go now, Nolan said.
Marsh went. Audra met Nolan at the edge of the yard. She'd been watching from the window. How much?
300. She closed her eyes briefly. That's a lot. It's not enough. He walked past her toward the barn. She followed him. You can't fight Clifton with. I know what I can't do.
He stopped at the barn door and turned to face her.
What I need to know is whether there's anyone on your side, someone who could testify, someone who knew your father, someone who knows what Clifton has been doing with the estate. She thought about it with the focus she brought to everything.
There's a woman named Hazel Finch, she said slowly. She was my mother's attorney, handled the estate before my father rewrote the will. She knows where the money actually came from, which portions my mother built, which Clifton had no legitimate claim to.
And she doesn't like Clifton because he tried to have her disbarred when she pushed back on the new will. Where is she?
Fort Worth.
That's 2 days, I know. Nolan was quiet for a moment. I can make it in a day and a half if I leave at first light. You'd go yourself? Somebody has to.
He looked at her.
You're staying here because I don't trust
Pruitt not to come while I'm gone.
Tom Rideout up the road. He'll watch the place. But you keep the doors locked and the revolver close. She stared at him. Why are you doing this? He thought about it seriously before he answered. Because you fixed my books, he said finally.
Because you walked into this house and inside a week you'd made it run better than it has in 3 years. Because when Clifton showed up, you didn't flinch. He paused.
And because I'm tired of living like nothing here matters enough to fight for.
Something shifted in her face.
Not quite softness, more like the wall going down a single stone. All right, she said. I'll write to Hazel tonight. He left before dawn. The ride to Fort Worth took a day and a night, stopping once to rest the horse. He found Hazel Finch at her office on a side street near the courthouse, a small woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned severely back, and eyes that had spent 40 years deciding whether people were telling the truth. She listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds. Then she said, Clifton tried to have my license pulled because I told James Crane that what he was doing with the will was legally questionable and ethically indefensible. She folded her hands. I told him the same thing about Harlan Yost. James didn't listen to me. He rarely did about Clifton. Will you testify? She looked at him carefully. What's your interest in this woman? She's my wife. You've known her for a month. A little more than that. And yet here you are in Fort Worth at my office. Nolan held her gaze. She needed someone to show up. He said it plainly. That's all. Hazel Finch studied him for a moment longer. Then she said, I'll need to review the relevant documents, and I'll need travel expenses. She paused. And someone to look after my cat. He arranged for a neighbor to handle the cat. She was in Delwood 4 days later. Audra met her at the stage with a composure that only broke for a moment when Hazel took her hands and said, You look like your mother when she was standing her ground. The hearing was scheduled in the county seat, 2 weeks out. Hazel spent those weeks in methodical preparation, going through documents, interviewing Audra, interviewing Nolan, drafting legal responses that took apart Clifton's arguments with the patience of someone dismantling a clock. She was not dramatic about it. She was thorough. Clifton's lawyer came to town with 2 associates and rented the largest room at the hotel. Clifton himself arrived the day before the hearing, and Nolan saw him on the street once, walking toward the courthouse, hands in his coat pockets, looking like a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory.
Audra saw him too from the window of their rented room. She watched him cross the street below and said nothing for a long while.
He believes he'll win, she said finally. Probably, Nolan agreed. She turned from the window. Does that scare you? Yes, he said honestly, but I'd rather be scared and standing than safe and sorry. She almost smiled. That's an odd thing to say. Told you I wasn't much for sentiment. They went to bed that night in separate rooms.
The arrangements in town were modest, and they'd maintained the same careful distance they'd kept since she arrived. But in the morning, when they walked to the courthouse side by side, she reached out and took his hand, not for show, just for the 2 steps it took to cross the threshold.
Then she let go, and they went inside.
The judge was a man named Aldrich Sutherfield, not a name from Clifton's list of friendly appointments. Hazel had determined, which was the best they could hope for. He was 60-something, compact, with an expression suggesting he had seen every variation of human foolishness and no longer found any of it surprising. Clifton's attorney laid out the case with the fluency of a man who had made this argument before in different rooms with different names attached. Emotional distress, questionable judgment, a young woman separated from her family and support structure, pressured into a hasty marriage by circumstances beyond her control. Medical opinion from 2 doctors who had never met Audra, attesting to susceptibility. Hazel let it all finish before she stood. She did not use many words. She used documents, the original will with the specific language Clifton's interpretation relied on, the estate records showing which portions had come from Audra's mother's family and which from her father's businesses, a letter from James Crane's own solicitor, written 2 months before his death, raising concerns about the coercive nature of the guardianship clause, bank records showing that the funds Audra had used for her travel, funds Clifton called stolen, were from an account established in Audra's name by her mother, which had never legally come under the estate, and then Hazel called Audra to testify. Sutherfield asked her directly, the way judges sometimes did when they wanted to cut through the lawyers.
Mrs. Graves, do you believe yourself capable of making decisions about your own life? Audra looked at him steadily. I managed my father's household accounts at 19.
I identified billing fraud in my husband's business within 24 hours of arriving at his ranch. I traveled across 3 states alone with limited funds and no assistance and arrived where I intended to go. She paused.
If that is not capable, I'd like to know what is.
Clifton's attorney tried to reframe it as evidence of erratic behavior, a woman who ran from her responsibilities, made impulsive decisions, acted out of panic rather than reason.
Hazel stood again. The opposing counsel has called my client's escape impulsive. I'd ask the court to consider that Miss Crane. Mrs. Graves spent 11 days confined to her childhood home before she made that decision.
She arranged finances, identified a transportation route, maintained cover across multiple stops, and selected a legal remedy, marriage, that protected both her person and her assets. She paused. That is not panic. That is planning. That is a woman thinking clearly under extraordinary pressure. Clifton testified. He was composed, appropriately concerned, the picture of a devoted brother who only wanted what was best. He spoke about their father's wishes, about Audra's history of difficulty making decisions, about his genuine fear for her welfare. Hazel cross-examined him with the precision of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this moment.
Mr. Crane, you testified that your sister has difficulty making decisions.
Can you name one financial decision she made incorrectly while she was managing your father's household accounts?
A pause. She was very young when. A specific decision, please.
He couldn't name one. You testified that you confined your sister for her own protection. Can you name the specific danger you were protecting her from? She was going to make a choice that would harm her future. You mean she was going to refuse the marriage you'd arranged? You confined an adult woman to her home for 11 days because she said no. Hazel let that sit. And you have now traveled to a separate county and spent. She named the figure Audra had estimated, a considerable sum in legal fees to force that woman to come back and say yes.
She looked at Sutherfield. The court should decide what this case is actually about.
Sutherfield took an hour to deliberate. Nolan and Audra sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway, not speaking.
At one point she said, if we lose, and he said, we won't. And she said, but if we do, and he said, then we appeal. And she said, with what money? And he said, we'll figure it out.
And she made a sound that might have been a laugh. When Sutherfield returned, he did not take long to speak. He found the medical evaluations insufficient, the guardianship clause inapplicable to a woman of 26 who had demonstrated clear financial independence, and the marriage valid and legally sound. He denied both of Clifton's petitions. He also said, for the record, that confining an adult woman against her will to enforce a marital arrangement was not guardianship, and that future proceedings of this nature brought before his court would be treated accordingly. Clifton walked out of the courtroom without looking at Audra. Marsh followed him, already talking. Their footsteps echoed down the hall, and then they were gone. Audra sat very still for a moment. Then she put her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook, and Nolan put an arm around her and did not say anything, because sometimes there is nothing to say.
Hazel Finch found them in the hallway on her way out.
She looked at Audra for a moment and then said, simply, "Your mother would have wanted to see that."
Then she squeezed Audra's hand and left, heels sharp on the courthouse floor. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the light going gold over the scrub grass and the low hills. Audra was quiet most of the way, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one she'd arrived with. Not compressed, not held down, just tired. Will he try again? Nolan asked. She thought about it. Eventually, maybe. But Sutherfield's ruling makes it harder, and Hazel's documentation of the estate.
He knows now that if he pushes, things about how he's managed the accounts will come out that he doesn't want public.
So he might just leave it alone. He might. And Yost? She was quiet a moment.
Harlan Yost has other people he can pressure. I'm not worth enough trouble to him now that the legal claim is off the table. She looked at the road.
I think it might actually be over.
Nolan nodded. He drove the rest of the way with the reins loose in his hands and let the evening settle around them. Back at the ranch, Tom Rideout was waiting in the yard, wanting to know how it had gone. Nolan told him, and Tom said, "Well, good," and headed home on his mule, satisfied. The way neighbors in that part of Texas were. Inside, Audra made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark while it brewed. The canvas satchel was on the table beside her, the one she'd kept at her side since she arrived. She looked at it for a moment. "Can I leave this somewhere?" she said. Not at arm's reach. He took it to his room and put it in the trunk at the foot of the bed. When he came back, she was at the table with 2 cups poured and the household ledger open. Not because there was anything urgent in it, but because it was familiar, and familiar felt good tonight.
They sat across from each other like they had every evening since she arrived, the lamp between them, the accounts open and the coffee warm. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't what anyone would write a song about, but it was something.
After a while, she said, "I've been thinking about the east pasture. The rotation schedule you're running is losing you 3 weeks of good grazing per year. If you shifted the cattle to a different pattern starting in spring, you'd get better weight on them by fall."
He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You figured that out when?"
2 weeks ago. She almost smiled.
"I wasn't sure I'd be here in spring to see it through." He set the cup down. "Are you now?"
She met his eyes.
Yes, she stayed.
Winter came in early, harder than most years, and they worked through it the way ranchers do, one day at a time, keeping things alive. Audra brought in 2 neighboring families' accounts on top of their own, because word had gotten around about what she'd done with the billing situation at Teller's, and people who dealt in livestock and equipment trusted her in the particular way. They trusted someone who could do math in their head and wasn't afraid to say so. By February, the ranch was running at numbers Nolan hadn't seen in years. By March, he'd hired a hand for spring roundup, a young man named Bray who was quiet and reliable, and visibly intimidated by Audra in a way that amused Nolan more than he admitted. On a cold evening in late February, Nolan found Audra standing in the main room looking at a photograph she'd taken from the satchel. He stopped in the doorway. "My mother," she said, without turning around. She knew he was there.
She always seemed to.
She had this same expression when she'd won an argument.
The one where she wasn't smiling yet, but she was about to. She lowered the photograph. "I don't know how to do this." She said it simply, without self-pity. Being somewhere and choosing to be there. Not just enduring it. He came into the room and stood beside her. "You already are. It doesn't feel like it yet. That's how you know it's real." He looked at the photograph in her hand. The pretend kind always feels perfect. The real kind takes some getting used to.
She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need to write to Hazel about the estate documentation. There are accounts Clifton controls that I have a rightful claim to, and now that the court has ruled..." She stopped. "Sorry. You don't need to hear all of this tonight."
"I like hearing it," he said honestly.
She looked at him with an expression that was part assessment and part something else.
"You're a strange man, Nolan." "So I've been told." What she said next came out quieter than he expected. "I think I'd like to stay here a long time." "Good," he said. "Because I'd like you to." They didn't say anything more important than that for another month, but something had shifted quietly in the way things shift in real life. Not all at once, but in small adjustments, each one so small you barely notice until you look back and realize the whole picture has changed.
The letter from Clifton came in April, short, formal, written by Marsh. He had chosen not to pursue further action. The estate matters would be referred to a neutral administrator. Audra's share would be made accessible through appropriate legal channels. She read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked out the window at the spring grass coming up green in the east pasture. The pasture she'd changed the rotation on 2 months prior, just as she'd planned.
Then she looked at Nolan and said,
I think we need a better fence on the south property line before the summer. He smiled.
I know. And we should talk to the rideouts about sharing the grain supplier. I've run the numbers and we'd both save. Audra.
She stopped. He reached across the table and took her hand.
We have time.
She looked at their hands for a moment. Then she turned hers over and held on. Outside, the grass was coming in green after a long winter. Bray was doing something loud and clumsy with the fence posts near the barn. The chickens were complaining about it. The coffee on the stove was starting to boil.
It was ordinary, all of it.
But ordinary was what she'd been running toward all along, not the flight, not the courtroom, not the confrontation.
Just this.
A place where she could sit at a table with someone who wasn't trying to manage her, and know that tomorrow would look a lot like today, and that was exactly enough.